In the heart of the Sinai desert, where the rock meets the sky and the wind whispers ancient psalms, lived a man whose name was written not in the sand, but in the hearts of those who longed for God with all their being. Saint John Climacus, also known as John of the Sinai, did not found empires, fight battles, or preside over councils, but he conquered the soul of silence and from the invisible built a ladder to eternity. His life was a path without deviation. From his youth, he renounced the world not out of contempt, but out of desire for something higher. Instead of seeking thrones, he sought the cave. Instead of crowds, he sought solitude. And in that fervent retreat, amidst the cliffs of the holy mountain, he found, step by step, the rungs that lead the soul from dust to the light of God. In a time of monks and emperors, of great theological debates and wars between kingdoms, he chose another path, the path of inner ascent, the battle against oneself, the path of radical humility. What he lived in silence, he left in words. His work, The Ladder of Paradise, written out of obedience and not vanity, became a beacon for the entire Christian Eastern spiritual tradition. John did not write to be quoted, nor did he live to be venerated. He lived to die to the world and be resurrected in God. And in that voluntary death to all things earthly, he became a teacher to generations of souls who, like him, wished to ascend the holy mountain. This is the story of Saint John Climacus, a man who heard the call in the whisper of the wind, who chose the rock over the throne, who embraced fasting, penance, and absolute love as the steps of a single desire to see God and never descend again. In the fertile valleys of Palestine, in an era when the Byzantine Empire wove its power between marbles and ashes, a child was born who would not become a prince or a general, but a pilgrim of the Spirit. His name was John, and from his first heartbeat his heart seemed to beat to the rhythm of another world. While other children entertained themselves with games and human ambitions, John gazed at the sky with the awe of one who senses that they belong to something greater. From a young age, John showed an exceptional intelligence and a sweetness of soul that disarmed those around him. His teachers admired his prodigious memory, his sharpness in interpreting classical and sacred texts, and his ability to reason like a much older man. But what surprised them the most was his detachment. Nothing seemed to hold him, neither compliments nor the prospects of a brilliant career, nor the possibilities his well-off family could offer him. Deep within his soul burned a fire that even he could not explain. The noise of the world bothered him like a distant hum, and the pleasures of the earth only fueled his thirst for something that still had no name. Books were not enough, debates did not satisfy him. What his heart sought could not be found in the classrooms of the wise, but in the desert of the pure. At the age of 16, when many are just beginning to build their dreams, John made a decision that seemed like madness to his contemporaries, to leave everything behind. He abandoned his home, his inheritance, his future, and set out for the desert of Sinai. He was not driven by tragedy nor attracted by a romantic ideal, but moved by an inner impulse stronger than instinct, a call that did not come from outside, but from the depths of his being, where God had already spoken to him with the voice of eternity. He presented himself before the monks of the monastery of St. Catherine at the foot of the mountain where the burning bush had not consumed itself. The elders, hardened by penitence and grace, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. What could such a young man be looking for among men who walked every day toward the death of themselves? John did not seek teaching, authority, or recognition. He only wished to obey, to be shaped, to learn how to die to the world. He was received with caution as both a challenge and a promise. He was assigned to an elder, a silent and wise starets, to guide him on the narrow way. And that was where his true birth began. For years, John devoted himself entirely to obedience and service. He washed the feet of pilgrims, swept the stones of the cloister, cooked with silent hands, and spent the nights vigilantly weeping for what he did not yet understand with his mind. He became a perfect disciple, not for his brilliance, but for his docility. He learned to master his tongue, to purify his thoughts, to transform every moment into an offering. The rule was not harsh, it was absolute. Perfection was not demanded, only total surrender. And John offered himself as a burning lamp, slowly consuming itself in the flame of vigilance. While his childhood companions rose in politics or letters, he descended step by step in humility and silence. But far from withering, his soul blossomed. The Word of God, meditated day and night, became his sustenance. The divine presence, once only intuited, began to reveal itself as a sweet and terrible breath. And it was then that he understood that the monastery was only the threshold, not the temple. He had learned external obedience, but God was now asking for the most radical sacrifice, total retreat, solitude without human comfort. With the permission of his abbot, John set off for absolute solitude. A cave in Thola, at the foot of Sinai, would be his dwelling for more than 20 years. No disciples, no books, no applause. Only God, his soul, and the battle that purifies all. There, the true ascent would begin. There, where walls do not protect, where the night does not end, where temptation never sleeps, the young man who had renounced the world would begin to climb toward heaven, one step at a time, with no company other than grace. The sun of the Sinai fell like a sword of fire upon the bare stone. There, amidst the rocky folds of the desert, John had chosen to live his voluntary exile. A small cave without a door or curtain, without a bed or adornment, would be his cell. Not out of punishment or disdain for the world, but out of hunger for God. The world had not rejected him. He had left it behind. He had intelligence for books, eloquence for teaching, and charisma for guiding. But he wanted no other school than silence, no teacher but the Spirit, no crowd but solitude. For more than 20 years, John lived like the ancient prophets, with no other company than his thoughts, his tears, and his Lord. He was not a misanthropic hermit or a proud ascetic. He was a lover. And like any lover, he needed silence to listen. He would rise in the darkness of the dawn, when the wind was still silent, and lift his heart in prayer. He did not recite out of obligation, but out of necessity. His breath was a constant invocation. A Lord Jesus murmured until his mind was still and his soul opened. The temptations never ceased in the cave. On the contrary, they refined themselves. In the monastery, one fights against impulses. In solitude, one fights against the illusion of having overcome them. John discovered that the devil doesn't always roar. Sometimes he whispers, flatters, persuades, and so he watched. He fasted not to impress himself, but to remind himself that bread is not everything. He kept vigil not to be seen, but to avoid falling asleep at the most sacred moment. The cave, over the years, became a temple. The birds grew accustomed to his singing, the scorpions did not sting him, and the sky seemed closer there. Yet John never believed he had attained anything. Every day was a new fall, a new ascent. Each step he climbed revealed how far he still was from the summit. His fame inevitably began to spread. Shepherds, pilgrims, wandering monks came from afar just to see him, hear him, touch the stone where he sat. He did not reject them, but neither did he seek them. He offered them a brief word, a gesture, a blessing. And each soul that left felt they had stood before a living temple. One of his visitors wrote, "John speaks like one who has already died and sees things with the eyes of the resurrected." Another wrote, "There is no shadow in his gaze. He looks with the weight of silence." Many wanted to stay with him. to form a community, to learn from his example. But he dissuaded them. "My school is not made for many. Go to the monastery, obey, love anonymity. There you will be sanctified." At night, when no one was watching, he cried for the world, not for its wars or its kings, but for the souls that were being lost to vain things. In his heart, all creation fit, and although the cave was narrow, his soul was wider than the valleys. And so, day after day, year after year, John's voluntary exile became the hidden heart of Sinai, the place where heaven descended, not with thunder like in Moses' time, but with the whisper of the Spirit upon a soul in prayer. The monastery of St. Catherine, at the foot of Mount Sinai, continued its rhythm of centuries. In its walls, psalms were prayed with the same cadence as in days of old. In its corridors, footsteps were light, filled with humility and vigilance. But after the death of its abbot, the balance was broken. The monks found themselves like sheep without a shepherd, and in the silence of their cells, one prayer was repeated, that John would return. The oldest monks remembered his youth among them. They knew that the man who had withdrawn to the desert was not just a solitary, but a soul filled with light. And so, with fear and reverence, they went to seek him. They found him as always, in silence, his face lit by prayer, his eyes beyond time. John listened to them, but did not respond immediately. He spent the night in prayer, as he always did before making a decision. He did not feel worthy to govern others. He did not trust in his own strength, but obedience did not allow him to say no. At dawn, he descended from the mountain, not with pride, but with a heart full of trembling. He ascended to authority by descending within. As abbot, John did not change the rules, nor did he add new regulations. He changed hearts. He governed by example, taught with silence, and corrected with firm tenderness. He was the first to rise, the last to rest. His face did not command, but his very presence inspired reverence. The brothers saw him walking through the cloister as if the air around him had become lighter. When he spoke, his words were few and precise, as if measuring each one on the scale of eternity. The novices followed him, as one follows a father, with reverent fear and deep love. The elders looked at him with gratitude, as one who knows that in him there was a continuation of the ancient fire. John was a bridge between generations, a living memory, a mirror of what every monk desired to be. Letters began to arrive from all corners of the empire. Abbots, bishops, even prelates from Constantinople sought his counsel, discernment, and wisdom, and he responded, not from the height of his title, but from the depth of his soul. Every word he wrote had the flavor of prayer and the form of a step. Many wanted to visit him, others wanted to stay. Some sought to be his disciples, to live under his shadow. But John did not seek to form a school, but to form saints. He repeated, "Do not follow me, but the Christ who guides me. I have no light of my own. If something shines in me, it is because he has willed it." During his abbacy, the monastery flourished, not in numbers, but in fire. The prayer was more intense, charity more palpable, and silence deeper. It was said that Sinai, upon seeing him, recalled the days of Moses. He was not a ruler, but a servant, and like every good servant, he knew that his position was just a step on the journey. Therefore, when his time came, he descended from the throne as he had ascended, with his soul inclined, his eyes fixed upward, with the certainty that true authority is not possessed but given. It was an abbot from another monastery, Rythu, who begged John to write, not for fame or study, but as nourishment for the monks who could not sit at his feet. John, who sought to avoid all recognition, resisted at first. How could he turn into words the fire of the soul, the blood of battle, the silence that teaches more than 1,000 speeches? But the obedience that had guided him all his life softened his heart. And so, he wrote, "Thus, the ladder of paradise was born. 30 rungs like 30 years of Christ in hiding, 30 steps, not towards success, but towards renunciation. Each chapter was a lived experience, not a theory. Within them lay the complete itinerary of the soul, from renunciation of the world to the fullness of charity. It was the map of ascension." John did not use ornate words or theological flourishes. His style was like his life, clear, direct, fervent. He named the passions with the precision of a spiritual surgeon: anger, lust, pride, acedia. But he did not limit himself to warning. He offered remedies: fasting, prayer, humility, vigilance of the heart. Each step was not just a goal, but a medicine. The book quickly became a gem of monastic spirituality. It did not take long to reach Constantinople, Jerusalem, the deserts of Syria and Egypt. The abbots copied it with reverence. The novices memorized it. The elders reread it with tears. And even today, centuries later, it is still read every Lent in the monasteries of Eastern Christianity, as if the words had been written this morning. But more than a work, the ladder was a portrait of John himself. Whoever read its pages saw reflected the man who had lived them, a fighter, humble, awake, in love with God. His teaching had as its goal not knowledge but transformation. He did not seek to form wise men, but saints. Each step was a death and a resurrection. Each fall described a tender warning, each victory a call to gratitude. Because John knew that one does not ascend to heaven by one's own strength, but by clinging to mercy. The structure of the book was inspired by Jacob's vision of the ladder, but even more, it was inspired by the lives of the monks who struggled daily to reach the stillness of the heart. It began with the external renunciation of the world, obedience, humility, and progressed to the interior: silence, pure prayer, contemplation. In the end, the last rungs no longer spoke of struggle, but of peace, apatheia, perfect love, joy without cause. And while other monks read it in the shadow of their cells, he continued to climb in his own soul by that very same ladder, step by step, with wounded feet, but eyes fixed on the heights. After years of service as abbot, guiding souls along the narrow path and lighting hearts with his serene words, Saint John Climacus felt that it was time to be silent once again. Not out of weariness or forgetfulness, but out of fidelity to the same silence that had shaped him. The soul, once it has said what it must, returns to listen. He renounced the office of abbot without ceremony. He did so with the same naturalness with which he had accepted authority, as just another step in the ladder. He returned to his cave, to the embrace of the mountain that had sheltered him for decades, to the corner where the earth touches the sky. There, without disciples surrounding him, without secretaries writing down his words, he resumed his intimate dialogue with God. No one knows how long he lived after his renunciation. The days in the desert are not counted by suns, but by prayers. Some said that he conversed with angels. Others claimed that he wept for the sins of the world. He neither confirmed nor denied. He simply lived as he had always lived, stripped, present, loved. In the final years of his life, he left no exhortations or commands. His legacy was already written in hearts, and his testament was the peace that dwelled in his gaze. His hands trembling, still lifted up at night. His voice, barely a whisper, still repeated the name. But solitude was no longer a battle. It was a summit. The soul that had once ascended with effort now rested, as if it had reached the heart of the mountain. He had no visions, no ecstasies, no glorious revelations. Only the gentle and profound certainty that God is enough. The day of his departure was not marked by spectacular signs, The earth did not tremble, nor did lightning descend. Only silence grew denser. The brothers who occasionally visited noticed that his cave was empty. His body, still warm, rested in peace. His closed eyes, his serene countenance, and his hand resting upon his work, as if indicating, "I have arrived." His burial was humble. No mausoleum was erected, no hymns were composed. He was buried in the earth he loved, beneath the stones that had been his companions. But in the hearts of the monks, in the pages of his ladder, in the breath of the Sinai at dusk, something had changed forever. For John did not die. He ascended, and he left behind the way. Throughout the centuries, the steps of Saint John Climacus have not been erased from the sands of Sinai. His ladder remains upright as a beacon in the middle of the desert, and each step continues to resonate in the hearts of those who long for God with a hunger for heaven. His name, inscribed in liturgy and tradition, is not spoken with clamor, but with reverence. The Christian East venerates him as a father, teacher, guide for monks, and lover of silence. The fourth Sunday of Lent bears his name, and every March 30th, his memory shines like a torch in the vigil. His work, the Ladder of Paradise, has not aged. Despite the generations that have passed, his words still penetrate hearts, dismantling masks, lifting the soul step by step, fall after fall, to the summit of pure love. It was not written to impress, but to transform, and that power remains. Byzantine monasteries still read it aloud. The icons depict him in a tunic of fire, climbing among angels, while passions attempt to drag him down. But he ascends, and with him ascend those who follow him. He did not leave organized disciples, nor his own monastic rules, but he left the most essential, a path, a roadmap for those who dare to lose everything to find everything. Today, when the world spins faster and faster, when the noise drowns and the soul scatters, the figure of Saint John Climacus reminds us that there is a higher place, and that we reach it through renunciation, silence, vigilance, and love. He was not a man of his time. He was a man of God. And his time, then, has not ended. Saint John Climacus, Abbot of Sinai and Master of Spiritual Ascent, pray for us.